It was late in the winter of 2011, and I was in church, and I sat there, and I couldn't listen to the music, and I couldn't listen to the sermon being preached by someone who used to be my friend, and I prayed to the ceiling, and my prayers bounced off the ceiling and didn't go anywhere. And I had all of these people in my life now, my mom's oncologists and nurses and other doctors and Kendra's vision therapists and her doctors and people in my psychological support group. And I had all of these people, and I felt utterly and completely alone in church. And the church that I was in was a church that I had helped to start. I had believed that God had called me, number one, to be a pastor, but number two, to start new churches. And I had believed that God had, in His wisdom and in His providence, miraculously brought people together and the conference and brought us to this specific place so we could start this church. And now my life was crumbling around me. And I thought, where is God? My mom couldn't come to church because on Fridays she had chemo. And so Sabbath she was wiped out. And Kendra couldn't come to church with me because she had been injured. She'd had a concussion. And the music and the lights and everything, they all completely destroyed her. So she needed to be in a quiet, dark room with her medication. And so there I was in church trying to figure things out, and I couldn't, and I thought, God, didn't you call me? Didn't you have some kind of plan for my life? I mean, if I read the Bible right, and I think I do, right? I mean, if I read the Bible right, I see in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, where it says, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And I thought, where's the hope? Where's the future? You have plans for me? Or at the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, where God says specifically to Jeremiah, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you, and I have called you. And I had taken these promises to be promises for me, saying, God, you've called me. And here I am. My story is not the story of Joseph. I didn't suffer for 23 years or however long Joseph had to suffer. I didn't get sold as a slave, and I didn't get falsely accused and put into prison. But I got to tell you, with these things melting down in my life, I felt like I was completely boxed off from God. Let's take a minute to review where we've been in this series so far, the series 2020 Vision. Today's sermon is Coat of Many Sorrows. The first thing we talked about is that God has a plan for your life. Does He? That's what we've read in the Bible, so we're going to go with that premise. Number two, with God's vision, ordinary men and women turned the world upside down. Ordinary fishermen, ordinary tax collectors. We have somebody who was a fig farmer. Ordinary men and women turned the world upside down when they got a glimpse of God's vision for their lives. What we learned at the end of the book of Hebrews is that we are next in line. We are next in line to receive and live out God's vision in the world. God didn't just call people in the Bible times, he continues to call us. And then last week, when we looked at the story of Abraham, we saw that God is with us at each step, even when we don't know where we're going. God shows up wherever we are, and he points us one step down the road. And when we go there, God shows up where we are, and he points us one more step down the road. But he's with us the whole time. Today we turn to the book of Genesis chapter 37 and look at the life of Joseph. Genesis chapter 37 starts off telling us about a spoiled, goody two-shoes brat of a child who didn't know how to keep his mouth shut and didn't know how to get along with his brothers in a very dysfunctional family where the father was married to two women and loved one of the women and really didn't like the other one. Your family would be messed up too, I'm just saying. Genesis chapter 37. Jacob lived in the land, I'm in verse 1, where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the brothers of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, that's Jacob's name, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. That's not dysfunctional. Because he had been born to him in old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him, the so-called coat of many colors. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and your sheaves gathered around mine, and they bowed down to it." Yeah, you don't want to tell your brothers that. Come on, trying to pick a fight? His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to rule over us? Will you actually reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of this dream and what he had said. Then Joseph had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Good work, Joseph. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. When we're talking about living the life of God's vision, the idea that God has a vision for us, the idea that God has a calling for us, we take a look at the life of Joseph, and we see that Joseph very literally received God's vision, didn't he? He literally received 2 dreams, these visions, in his life. God has a plan for me. This is great stuff. But I want to tell you that the dreams Joseph receives are not a vision for him to work toward. Do you notice that? There's nothing here in these dreams that tells Joseph what all this means. These dreams don't tell Joseph, "Joseph, one day you're going to move to Egypt and you'll become the second in command in Egypt, and you need to start a really progressive food program so that people can get fed during hard years." That's not what the visions were. If God had given Joseph a really specific vision like that, Joseph could have thought the rest of his life out, right? He could have said, okay, well, so maybe when I'm 25, I need to move to Egypt. And then I really need to get to a place where I know something about agriculture and know something about food planning. And then I also need to get to know the people in command, get up in the administration, maybe meet the Pharaoh a few times, right? There's no way Joseph could have planned this. All the visions weren't a specific calling for him. All the dreams is this understanding from age 17 that God has some kind of a plan. God has something. Joseph knows from an early age that God has a vision for his life. Joseph doesn't understand the vision yet. Joseph doesn't know what it is. And if he knew all the steps that it would take to get there, he would probably say, no, thank you, please do not sign me up. Look what he went through. This next slide, it's all on one. Joseph went through the pit. When he was 17 years old, he goes out to meet his brothers to give them food, and his brothers say, here comes that dreamer. They strip his coat of many colors off him. They throw him into a dry cistern, a well, and he's there. And if he had looked at that in context of his dream, he would notice it's exactly backwards. The stalk isn't standing upright, and his brother's bowing down before him. Now he is in the bottom of a well looking up at his brothers crowding around the top of the well. Exactly the opposite. Joseph is in the pit. And I don't know about you, but to me, if I were in the pit with exactly the opposite of God's vision going on, I would say, maybe those were just dreams. Maybe those were just dreams. Maybe that wasn't the voice of God. Maybe it was just, you start to question things and you start to doubt things and you think, why do my brothers hate me so much? Can't they see I'm such a good child? Right? Can't they see I just love them? Love them enough. It's tough love, right? I love them enough to tell on them, get them in trouble. But there's Joseph in the pit, probably questioning and doubting and wondering if they're going to kill him. They've stripped off the robe. And then a group of Midianites comes by. And the brothers decide to sell Joseph to the Midianites as a slave. Well, I don't know if this is good news or bad news. Do I want to be pulled out of this pit just so I can be sold to some foreigners so I can be a slave? I don't think so. Out of the frying pan into the fire. And so he gets sold to slaves, as a slave to the Midianites, and the Midianites go to Egypt and they sell him to Potiphar. And now he's in Potiphar's service as a slave. We see this in chapter 39 of Genesis. I want to read verse 2. I'll start with verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Verse 2, listen to verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. Those are the first words in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. He lived in the house with his Egyptian master, and when his master saw that the Lord was with him and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his whole household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Good job, Joseph. This is Joseph taking a minute and saying, even though I was in the pit, even though I was sold as a slave, even though I am enslaved in a foreign land, I will live with integrity. I will live for God. I will work to make my master successful. I don't know if I could do it. Then, after a while, Potiphar's wife falls in love with Joseph. Actually, my Bible says this: now Joseph was well built and handsome. It says it in that voice too. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns is entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this household than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except for you, because you are his wife." Even in slavery, even though he could have been very jaded right now in his heart, he could have played the victim. He could have said, "Look, and I'm just a servant, and if this is what the master's wife says to do, I'm going to do it because I'm just a servant. In fact, not just a servant, I'm just a slave. What rights do I have anyway, right?" But he didn't. Joseph chose to live a life of integrity. I will do the right thing no matter what, because God has something for me. God has a plan for me. God has a vision for me. Back when I was 17 years old, I had these dreams. And these dreams now were something important. God has something for me. I'm not going to mess that up. And so, at age 28, Joseph was falsely accused and he was thrown into prison. I've never been falsely accused. I've never been thrown into prison. I think Arpad here has. And you wonder in prison, does God still have a plan for me? Is God doing something? Or is God just sitting and waiting? Is there even a God? Is God listening? If I pray, does God hear me or not? Is this part of God's plan? I certainly hope not, because God must be a really bad planner. And so there is Joseph in the prison. I want to read a little bit of this to you. It's also in chapter 39. Verse 20. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, verse 21, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Gave him success in whatever he did? Really? Is God giving Joseph success in whatever he does? I mean, Joseph is in prison. And he got there from being a slave. And he got there from being in the pit. Really? But this is what it says. It says, God was with Joseph right there in the prison. And whatever Joseph did in the prison, God gave him success. And then through this amazing set of circumstances, which you can read in chapters 39 and 40 and 41, Joseph ends up in the palace, interpreting dreams for Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh understands all of this, Pharaoh understands that Joseph has wisdom that is not his own. Joseph has wisdom that is from God. That God is indeed with Joseph. No matter where Joseph was, God was with him. Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command and says, Joseph, you run this food program. And then 9 years later, Joseph's family comes, and his brothers bow down before him, and his father comes and bows down before him, and it's just like Joseph saw in his dream at age 17. At age 40, Joseph sees the fulfillment of the dream that he had when he was 17. It took a while. I'm not that patient. If God tells me He's going to do something for me, I really want it done this week. You know, we live in an email society now where if I want to talk to someone in Australia, I can send an email to them and they send me back a reply and I can send them back 20 replies, you know? We can talk almost instantaneously. I don't have patience anymore to wait for a letter to come in the mail. I certainly don't have patience to wait on God for 17 years when I'm rotting in a prison cell and being worked to death as a slave and being sold and being hated and being put in the pit by my brothers. So we look at this. Joseph had had this glimpse of greatness. Joseph's childhood vision gave him a perspective of God's constant care. This vision that Joseph had had when he was 17 was not outlining the future path for Joseph. Joseph, God says, go get yourself hated by your brothers, first off. That's the most important. And then you've got to goad them on so they throw you in a pit and they'll sell you to the Midianites. And then if you do really badly, maybe you can get sold to Potiphar. And then if you can somehow get his wife to lie about you and accuse you, then I can put you in prison where you'll be found by Pharaoh. No. The vision was not about Joseph figuring out how he was going to plan the rest of his life. This vision was simply Joseph's understanding of God's constant care. This was simply Joseph now going, I now understand that God had a plan all along, even when I was dying. God had a plan all along, even when I was suffering. Well, 17 years later, after the family reunion, we see Joseph's father passing away. And start in verse 15 of Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Joseph cried. Verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before Joseph and said, we are your slaves. They realized they'd treated him bad. They realized they'd thrown him in the pit. They realized that Joseph now, if he'd held a grudge, had every right inside Egypt to just have them all killed, Kill these guys. I don't need them anymore. They're bad memories for me. Listen to verse 20. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in place of God?" Verse 20. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. 17 years later, we gain this insight into Joseph's understanding. Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to do evil to me, but God intended it for good so that people's lives could be saved." Oh, this is Joseph's understanding now, closer toward the end of his life. You know, he starts to understand this. He's thinking, my brothers had this really bad plan, but look, God had this plan. Maybe God needed me, and he's just thinking, maybe God needed me to be in the pit so I could get separated from my brothers. And maybe God needed me to be sold to these guys so that I could get sold to Potiphar, because Potiphar served Pharaoh. And so when I was falsely accused then, I was put in Pharaoh's prison so I could get put in contact with Pharaoh. So now Joseph is looking at this through a different lens. He's looking at this through a lens of providence, where he says, maybe God was responsible for all of this. It's kind of a dangerous thought, isn't it? Joseph sees God's hand now in his life of sorrow. Does this mean God caused the sorrow? Does this mean God orchestrated it so that his brothers would hate him, so that they'd throw him in the pit, so that he could get sold as a slave, so he could get falsely accused, so that he could get thrown into prison? Is God behind all of that? That's what the text seems to say. I mean, Joseph's understanding is certainly this way now. Joseph says it just like that. You intended it for evil, but God, he uses the same word, God intended it for good, to save people's lives. See, the Message Bible takes our common understanding of this and says it differently. The Message Bible says, what you intended for evil, God was able to use for good, for saving people's lives. I mean, that's how we'd understand those texts, right? Certainly God doesn't cause evil things to happen. Certainly God doesn't cause people to hate other people, does he? God doesn't cause people to get sold into slavery. God doesn't cause people to get falsely accused and thrown into prison, does he? Do we serve a deterministic God? A God that says, I have your life mapped out for you in advance and you can't change it no matter how hard you try? Is that the kind of God we serve? No. We serve a God of choice, don't we? We serve a God of free will. A God who says, okay, you've chosen that, now I'm going to meet here with you. Or, oh, this bad thing happened. You know, Jesus said it this way when he tells the story of the wheat and the tares. He looks out at the field and he says, an enemy has done this. All of that evil that's sown into the world, all of the bad things that happen, an enemy has done this. And so I like the way the Message Bible translates it. What you intended for evil, God was able to use for good. That has to be our theological understanding of this, but it wasn't Joseph's understanding. Joseph understood it that his brothers had chosen this, but God had chosen the exact same thing for a different result. I want to tell you, we can take a cue from Joseph's understanding, though, and we can use it in our lives. And it's these two words. It's these two words, but God. The words, but God, have the power to shift our perspectives. Joseph said it this way: you intended it for evil, but God. But God intended it for good, for the saving of people's lives. Anytime anything happens to us, we can, if we're trying to choose something, we say, I really want this to happen, and what if we put in the two words, but God? It shifts our perspective, doesn't it? It shifts a couple of things. It shifts our perspective heavenwards. It shifts our perspective back to morality. It shifts our perspective to how we treat other people. What if every time we came up against something bad happening in our lives, we could just stop and say, but God? But God what? What does God want to happen from this? What does God want to do in my heart? What does God want to do in my life? How does God want me to serve people? How does God want me to live with integrity, even though I'm a slave, even though I'm a falsely accused slave? The words, but God, can change it. Every day, because of the vision, because God has said to us, I have chosen you. You are my children. Every day, we get to choose whether we're going to live by that vision, by that identity, or whether we're going to live a life of deterministic victimhood, where we say, God's not doing anything for me. Here I am being sold as a slave. I might as well just live a life that doesn't mean anything, whatever. Here I am in prison. I'll just live like all of these other prisoners. That's not what Joseph did, because Joseph had this but God attitude, because he had vision that he'd been given at age 17, because he had an identity as a child of God. He said, no, I choose to live with an idea that God has a plan for me. I choose to live with vision. I am not a victim. I will not be a victim. I will live my life with God, because, as we see in the story, the Lord was with Joseph, even in the pit, even in slavery, even in prison. Late spring 2011, a little girl, 8 years old, named Rachel Beckwith, was sitting in church. And like we do here at this church, they were doing things with their kids to raise money for different mission projects. And so she was sitting in church, and she heard about how easy it was, if there was enough money, to get clean water to villages in Africa. And Rachel was kind of idealistic. You know, she was 8 years old. 8 years old can be idealistic. She was idealistic. And the year before, she had had her hair grown long. And when she got it cut off, she sent it to Locks of Love. And, you know, so she had this idea that she could help people. And so the next month, for her 9th birthday, she said to her mom, I don't want any presents this year. What I want is for people to donate $9, because I'm going to be 9 years old. It's for people to donate $9 so that people in Africa can drill wells. And so she had this goal of raising $300. And it was very exciting for her. And so she and her mom figured it out, and they put together this website. And they put it on Facebook and told all their friends about it. And she didn't quite make her goal. Not quite. I want to show you the video, and then I'll finish up. There's Rachel.
It's 6 in the morning and we're about to go see some of Rachel's wells.
I am Richard. I am Rachel's grandfather. I really wish Rachel could be here today. Because first of all, Rachel would think that this is probably the neatest thing she'd ever seen in her entire life.
Our community, our church, where we are from, we greatly love Rachel and continue to love her family. And I'm overwhelmed with how greatly you have honored her memory. So please receive my most deepest and heartfelt thanks. You've done us a great honor today, so thank you. Yeah.
Rachel developed such a big heart from such a young age that she understood and felt the pain of others on the other side of the world. To give up her birthday present so that other children can improve their lives is the most beautiful gift a person can give.
If you asked Samantha, Rachel's mom, Did God do this to Rachel so that people could have clean water? She'd say, are you kidding me? God didn't do this. An enemy did this. But she says this, God was able to use our suffering and loss to make a difference in the lives of thousands of villagers. Rachel's death has brought life to others. It's having the lens of providence, the lens of vision, the lens that God is with us, the lens of this happened to us, but God. But God is bigger. God has a plan. It's the same as with Jesus on the cross. Jesus suffered and died so other people could have life. I don't believe God orchestrated the evil to happen, didn't make people crucify Jesus. Satan did that. But it's through that death on the cross that we're provided with life, that we're provided with grace, that we're provided with peace and hope and new life. And so there are some next steps that we can do. And these aren't for everybody. Maybe you find one that's for you. Maybe you make up your own next step, a thing that you can do or think about differently over this next week. Number 1 says, I will start to look for the but God perspectives in my own daily life. Number 2 says this week I will look for daily ways to live a life of integrity and service, understanding my identity as a child of God Most High. Number 3 says, today or tomorrow I will write down difficult times in my past and ask God how He was leading me forward in it or through it. If you've gone through a lot of pain in your life, that might be the one that you need to do. Number 4 says this, I would like to enter into a growing relationship with God. If you and God aren't on speaking terms or you've backed out of a relationship recently, maybe number 4 is the one you need. If so, you can talk to one of the pastors here or one of the elders, and they'd be glad to pray with you and talk with you about how to have a relationship with God in your own life from day to day. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we understand today that the vision and the calling isn't always about us knowing what to do and knowing the steps to get there, but sometimes it's just a calm reassurance that you have a plan, even when we feel like our lives are in the pit, even when we feel estranged, even when we feel like we're somehow locked into a prison in our lives or relationships or finances or whatever. God, we know you are there with us. We know you have a plan, that we are your children. Teach us to live in that perspective every day. We pray in your name. Amen.